After receiving crucial information, the Metropolitan Police immediately got in touch with local law enforcement in Hertfordshire. What started as a lead quickly escalated into a full-scale operation. It was already deep into the night when the officers set out. Driving along empty country roads dimly lit by scattered street lamps, they followed their orders with quiet determination. Eventually, the path led them to a nearby nature reserve, a wooded area known to locals as Oxy Woods. The parking lot was empty, cloaked in silence and shadows. Taking no chances, one officer decided against using the route informer had mentioned. Instead, he opted for a less obvious path, worried the original trail might have been staged or tampered with. And then, in the early hours of the morning, precisely at 3 a.m., the operation came to a tragic end. The search was over. They had found Kate. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Kate Begley was born in 1974 in the United Kingdom, a place she would come to cherish deeply throughout her life. Raised in a nurturing, stable household, Kate's early years were filled with warmth, support, and guidance. From an early age, she stood out for her maturity, quiet confidence, and natural inclination to care for others. She was the kind of child who always finished her homework, looked out for younger kids, and offered a helping hand without being asked. Her family encouraged education, integrity, and kindness, values Kate carried with her throughout her life. Teachers described her as attentive and ambitious, and friends often relied on her for comfort and advice. She wasn't someone who craved attention, but rather someone who earned respect through consistent actions. After completing high school with solid academic results, Kate went on to earn a university degree, a milestone that brought pride not only to her, but to her entire family. She was drawn to the corporate world, particularly the energy sector, where she built a strong and upwardly mobile career. In time, she became a manager, one of Britain's major energy companies, where her professionalism and strong work ethic quickly earned her a reputation for excellence. Her position as a national compliance manager reflected not only her intelligence, but also her ability to lead, problem solve, and maintain high standards. Kate's colleagues admired her blend of professionalism and empathy. She treated those around her with consistent respect, and many described her as the kind of person who inspired confidence in others. She was organized, articulate, and had a calming presence in even the most stressful situations. She lived in the scenic town of Walton-on-Thames, a tranquil suburb known for its leafy streets and riverside charm. It was here that she cultivated a balanced lifestyle. Kate was physically active, often going for runs or taking yoga classes. She prioritized health and wellness, and her love of nature and travel gave her life a sense of purpose beyond work. Friends recalled how she loved to explore new countries, try different cuisines, and learn about other cultures. Yet despite her adventurous side, she was also known to be cautious, especially when it came to meeting new people. Kate preferred to take her time building trust and avoided rushed or unplanned interactions. But on May 31, 2007, something deeply troubling occurred. Something that shook everyone who knew her. Kate, then 32 years old, did not show up for work. This was immediately unusual. Kate was punctual and responsible, the kind of person who would never miss work without notifying someone. Her father, growing increasingly concerned, recalled that she had gone out the evening before. Unable to reach her by phone, he decided to check on her in person. When he arrived at her home, it was quiet. There was no answer at the door, and the house appeared undisturbed. But Kate was nowhere to be found. To make matters worse, she had also missed a personal appointment, something entirely out of character. Her father, sensing something was very wrong, didn't wait any longer. He contacted the authorities and reported her as a missing person. Within hours, Kate's family and friends mobilized. They weren't content to wait passively. They organized search efforts, created and distributed missing persons posters, and alerted anyone who might have information. Facebook, though still relatively new in 2007, became a central hub for updates and sharing tips. Friends created a group to circulate information and raise awareness. Every detail mattered. Kate's disappearance sent shockwaves through her social and professional circles. People described her as loyal, kind-hearted and always smiling. Her optimistic attitude and genuine concern for others made her beloved in every corner of her life. Her success at a company like Centrica was no accident. She had worked tirelessly to get where she was, never cutting corners, never taking people for granted. And this made the situation even more alarming. This wasn't someone who would simply vanish or make impulsive decisions. She was someone who planned ahead and communicated clearly. Then, something happened that intensified everyone's concern. A few of Kate's close friends began receiving text messages from her phone. At first glance, this might have seemed like a good sign, but the relief was short-lived. The tone of the messages felt off, stiff, awkward, unlike the natural, warm language Kate normally used. Friends who had known her for years immediately picked up on this. Everyone has a unique texting style. Certain phrases, shorthand, emojis, or quirks in how they type. These messages lacked Kate's distinctive tone and used expressions that didn't match her personality at all. This unsettling development prompted a more detailed investigation. Authorities soon conducted a search of Kate's home and discovered a second mobile phone, one that hadn't been used to send those odd messages. Officers from the Missing Persons Unit began to examine it carefully. Among the numbers in her call history, one stood out. A man named Carl, who she had recently gone on a date with. None of her close friends knew much about him. He was relatively new in her life, having met her just a few weeks earlier at a nightclub in central London. They had arranged to meet on the evening before her disappearance, an important detail. The man's name was Carl Taylor, and the police knew they needed to speak with him immediately. They learned he lived in a modest one-bedroom flat in Covent Garden and had done so for nearly a decade. A background check revealed a criminal record. Not severe, but worth noting. In 2002, he had been convicted of obtaining property by deception. His mother, it turned out, had once urged him to seek help, and mental health professionals had spoken to him over the phone. With the clock ticking, investigators reached out to Carl Taylor directly. To their surprise, he picked up the phone. During their conversation, he confirmed that he had, in fact, met up with Kate the night before. According to him, after their meeting, she dropped him off at Twickenham, where he caught a bus home. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard from her since. However, something about his story didn't quite add up. When officers spoke with Carl's mother, her recollection raised red flags. She mentioned that in the early hours of May 31, Carl had arrived home in a car she didn't recognize, a Volkswagen Golf. He seemed preoccupied and had been seen cleaning the vehicle meticulously. The timing and behavior struck her as strange, but she hadn't connected it to anything specific at the time. Now that detail became a potential clue. When police initially contacted Carl Taylor about the disappearance of Kate Beagley, his explanation raised more questions than it answered. He claimed that the Volkswagen Golf he was driving, Kate's car, had been loaned to him by a woman who needed it cleaned so she could take her children to school. At first glance, this might seem like a favor between acquaintances, but the story immediately fell apart under even the slightest scrutiny. This wasn't just any woman. This was Kate, who at the time had already been reported missing. If she had indeed dropped him off in Twickenham and simply gone her own way, why would he be in possession of her vehicle the following morning? More troubling still, why hadn't he come forward with this information when police contacted him earlier, clearly concerned about her whereabouts? If there had been an innocent explanation, most people would have been eager to assist, not evasive or selective with details. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the car wasn't the only item of Kate's in Carl Taylor's possession. Detectives uncovered that early that same morning, just before 6 a.m., he had handed his mother a stack of shopping vouchers. This was not a typical gesture for him, and the suddenness of it raised eyebrows. Upon further examination, it was discovered that the vouchers weren't his to give. They had been taken from the glove box of Kate's car. Even more alarmingly, investigators learned that Carl had also sold a mobile phone to a friend, a phone that turned out to belong to Kate. He was reportedly pleased about his new car and was openly talking about it in the hours following her disappearance, showing no outward sign that anything was wrong. These inconsistencies and careless actions stood in stark contrast to the serious situation unfolding around him. Further inquiries brought to light that Kate's car had been captured on surveillance cameras just before midnight on May 30, crossing Chiswick Bridge in a direction completely opposite to where Kate lived. The driving behavior was erratic. enough to catch the attention of a police officer who witnessed the scene firsthand. That officer logged a check through the national system, a move that later became a critical timestamp in the investigation. With every passing hour and every new detail, the situation was growing increasingly dire. Carl Taylor was 27 years old at the time. Known to have trained in martial arts and having worked as a football coach and a personal fitness instructor. On paper, he appeared fit, confident, and socially active. But as the investigation closed in, a different picture was beginning to emerge. One marked by evasive behavior and actions that simply didn't align with someone who had nothing to hide. Authorities determined it was time to bring him in for a formal conversation. If this truly was a misunderstanding, as he seemed to suggest, then an in-person interview would allow him to explain himself fully and help move the investigation forward. However, when officers attempted to reach him again, the man who had so readily picked up his phone earlier that day had now gone completely silent. It's worth noting that police calls often appear as withheld or no caller ID, a fact not lost on those who wish to avoid them. Officers, suspecting Carl may have been screening calls, decided to take a more informal approach, using a personal number. This tactic worked. Carl picked up, but once again offered only the bare minimum of information. His story hadn't changed, and yet it still didn't hold up. The officers informed him that two of them would be coming up to London to take a formal statement. Given the concerning gaps in his account and the possessions of Kate's that had turned up in his hands, phone conversations were no longer sufficient. Surprisingly, Carl didn't object. But his response was unusual. Instead of offering to meet at a police station or in a neutral location, he suggested they meet him at a party he planned to attend that evening at a flat in Holland Park. For detectives working a missing persons case, this was a peculiar development. A woman he had recently gone out with had vanished under worrying circumstances, and rather than express concern, Carl was headed to a social event. His attitude didn't reflect the seriousness of the situation. The officers met him at the party, pulling him aside into a quieter room for a conversation. But even face-to-face, Carl remained distant. His responses were vague, his timeline shaky, and his demeanor noticeably closed off. As the party began to fill up, the atmosphere became less conducive to a police inquiry. Music grew louder. People laughed and mingled. Alcohol was being passed around. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was deeply inappropriate under the circumstances. Carl's behavior shifted again. He grew increasingly irritated, his body language more tense. The officers began to feel uneasy. Given his martial arts background and the unpredictability of the setting, the decision was made to remove him from the flat in a controlled and discreet manner. Backup was called in from the Metropolitan Police to assist if needed. To avoid raising suspicion, the lead detective created a casual pretext to get Carl to step outside to their vehicle. Unaware of what was unfolding, Carl complied. Once he was seated in the car, the officers calmly informed him that he was being placed under arrest on suspicion of kidnapping Kate Beley. He was transported to Walton-on-Thames and held in custody. The gravity of the case now required escalation. It was passed to the Major Crime Unit, and Detective Chief Inspector Mark Preston was appointed to lead the investigation. The focus shifted toward gathering as much information as possible while there was still a chance of locating Kate. But even in custody, Carl Taylor remained firm in his silence. He repeated the same story as before, showing no signs of offering new information. With each passing hour and still no trace of Kate, police faced a difficult decision. There was enough circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies, possession of her belongings, and behavioral red flags to suggest that something more serious had occurred. Carl Taylor was formally rearrested, this time on suspicion of murder. It was a weighty charge, one not made lightly. Investigators hoped this would prompt a response, perhaps even a confession, or a lead to Kate's location. But during the subsequent interview, Carl chose to remain entirely silent. His only response to every question asked was, no comment, no elaboration, no denial, no explanations. In an effort to gain more time, police successfully applied for a court order extending his detention. This would allow them to continue questioning him and pursue additional investigative leads. Yet Carl's approach didn't change. Through each interview session, his stance remained the same. an unwavering, uncooperative silence. As hope began to dim and the pressure increased, investigators pushed forward. There were still pieces missing in this puzzle, but they were now certain of one thing. The story Carl Taylor had told wasn't just incomplete. It was a cover. In the critical hours following his arrest, Carl Taylor continued to withhold information that could help bring clarity to the growing investigation. Despite being presented with multiple inconsistencies in his story and confronted with the troubling reality that he had been captured on CCTV footage topping up fuel in Kate Beagley's Volkswagen Golf, he gave no explanation for his actions. When questioned directly about the footage and the car, he offered no clarification whatsoever. What made the situation even stranger was a detail that left officers puzzled. He had only added 1 pound worth of petrol to the vehicle. It was an amount so insignificant that it made no logical sense, unless it had been an attempt to avoid detection by keeping the transaction brief. This, combined with the fact that he had been driving a missing woman's vehicle and had not informed anyone about it, created a deeply unsettling picture. While the evidence was mostly circumstantial at this stage, it strongly hinted at something far more serious than a misunderstanding. With hope fading for a voluntary breakthrough, officers decided it was time to let Carl return to his cell and reflect on the seriousness of the situation and the evidence being built around him. The strategy was simple. Let the weight of reality set in. That Sunday night, after hours of stonewalling and silence, Carl was permitted a phone call to his mother. A standard right, but one that often offers emotional insight for investigators monitoring behavior. After that call, the decision was made to conduct another formal interview with him, this time in hopes that the mounting pressure might finally bring out the truth. Meanwhile, Detective Chief Inspector Mark Preston, who had been tirelessly leading the case, had now been awake for over 24 consecutive hours. Exhausted and emotionally worn from the intensity of the investigation, he returned home to try and rest, but he barely had time to close his eyes before his phone rang. It was the station. Carl Taylor had just made a confession. In a shocking and emotionless admission, Carl acknowledged responsibility for Kate Beagley's death. When asked why, his answer was blunt and chilling in its simplicity. He had wanted her car. That was the motive. That was the reason. A single material desire had ended the life of someone so cherished by all who knew her. Carl revealed that Kate was in the Watford area of Hertfordshire. Upon receiving this information, the Metropolitan Police contacted local officers in Hertfordshire to coordinate what would now become a major operation. Every step had to be carefully planned. Carl was still in custody, and transporting him required not only high-level security but also constant filming and recording, both for legal transparency and to preserve every piece of evidence that might arise along the way. It was well into the night when the journey began. Officers, driving through quiet roads under dim streetlights, followed Carl's instructions as he navigated them toward the location. There was still a possibility this could be a false lead, another misdirection. But they had no choice but to follow it through. Eventually, Carl led them to a local nature reserve, a woodland area known as Oxy Woods. The car park was deserted, shrouded in silence and darkness, the kind of setting that made even seasoned officers uneasy. Carl stepped out and began directing them into the trees. Out of an abundance of caution, an officer decided to take a non-obvious path, avoiding the most direct trail Carl had indicated, in case it had been manipulated or concealed in some way. And then, in the early hours of the morning, at 3 a.m., the investigation reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The search was over. The site was immediately secured. Floodlights were brought in, the area was cordoned off, and crime scene specialists began the meticulous process of collecting every possible trace of evidence. Forensic investigators worked in silence, their movements careful and deliberate. Later that morning, a statement from Kate's family was released to the public. It was a message filled with love, pain, and remembrance. Her parents and her brother, Guy, spoke of Kate as a loving, thoughtful, dependable, loyal, and tremendously popular daughter, sister, granddaughter, godmother, and friend, who was devoted to her family and friends. They said that she would be missed by everyone who knew her, every day and in every way. The response from the community was overwhelming. flowers were left at the entrance of Oxy Woods. Strangers, moved by the story and its outcome, came to pay their respects. One card left behind read, "I never met you, but I feel like I have known you for a lifetime. My heart goes out to all those who were blessed with your love and friendship. The world is a sorer place without you." Despite exhaustive efforts at the scene, few personal items were recovered. Kate had to be formally identified through DNA testing. No murder weapon was found, and extensive fingertip searches yielded no additional belongings. Later, Carl revealed that after leaving the scene, he had thrown the evidence out of the car window while driving on the motorway. He also admitted to using some of the bottled water Kate kept in her car, casually, as if none of what had happened bore emotional or moral weight. Detectives now turned their attention to locating Kate's vehicle, which they believed could still contain critical evidence. Carl eventually disclosed its location, saying he had abandoned it on a housing estate in North London. When officers arrived, the car was exactly where he had said it would be. For Kate's loved ones, the days following were a blur of grief, disbelief, and unanswered questions. It was hard to reconcile the calm, everyday routine that Kate had lived with the violent end she had met. The entire ordeal felt surreal, especially given how sudden and unfathomable it was. Her family and friends struggled to find peace while still trying to understand what had really happened that night. Now, having offered his confession, Carl agreed to revisit the pub in Richmond Hill where he and Kate had gone for their first and only date. Across the road from the establishment was an embankment that overlooked the River Thames, a scenic spot with benches and a view. Investigators hoped that walking through the evening's events might unlock more details, pieces of the puzzle that could help them build the clearest picture possible of the timeline and motive. Eventually, with the full body of evidence before them, the confession, the location of Kate's, the recovered car, and other circumstantial connections, the Crown Prosecution Service approved a formal charge of murder against Carl Taylor. But in a stunning twist, despite having confessed, Carl pleaded not guilty in court. He now claimed that what had occurred had been in self-defense. This late pivot added a new layer of complexity to the case. Prosecutors were determined to ensure justice would be served, and to strengthen their case further, police investigators returned once more to the Oxy Woods Nature Reserve, determined to ensure that no stone had been left unturned, and that no potential clue, no matter how small, would be missed. In the weeks following his arrest and confession, Carl Taylor's behavior while on remand revealed a darker side of his personality, one that was not only troubling but deeply manipulative. It would later be reported that during his time behind bars, Carl had befriended two of the UK's most notorious offenders, Levi Belfield and Mark Dixie. Though this fact wasn't public knowledge at the time, it would come to light that Carl had grown surprisingly close to both men while in custody at Belmarsh Prison, one of the country's highest security facilities. According to Laura Richards, a respected criminal behavioral analyst and former head of the Homicide Prevention Unit at Scotland Yard, these three men did more than just share a prison wing. They shared strategies. She revealed that Belfield and Dixie had developed an odd, almost conspiratorial rapport after being housed in adjacent cells, which allowed them to communicate regularly. Over time, Carl Taylor was absorbed into this dangerous dynamic, and together, the trio allegedly coached one another in how to manipulate their upcoming court proceedings. Their goal? To confuse, deflect, and play the system. It was a chilling glimpse into how calculated some individuals can be, even after confessing to crimes that devastated countless lives. Within weeks, all three would face trial at the historic Old Bailey Courthouse in London, a venue that has hosted some of the most significant and high-profile trials in British legal history. And now, it was Carl Taylor's turn to stand before a jury and be judged not just for his actions, but for the lies and manipulation that followed. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The public gallery overflowed with journalists, friends of the victim, and members of the public eager to see justice delivered. Despite his earlier confession, Carl entered a plea of not guilty, surprising many. His defense now hinged on the claim that he had acted in self-defense, contradicting everything he had previously admitted. The prosecution opened their case by reminding the jury that Carl had confessed to the killing. Unprompted, uncoerced, and in explicit terms. The evidence, they argued, did not support any notion of self-defense. It was clear-cut, deliberate, and senseless. The jury was then walked through the timeline. Carl and Kate had first met on the 18th of May at a nightclub in Piccadilly, central London. After exchanging numbers and chatting, they agreed to go on a more formal date 2 weeks later. They chose a well-known pub on Richmond Hill, an area popular for its scenic views and quiet charm. However, witnesses at the pub described an encounter that felt strained and one-sided. According to one bystander who spoke to police, as soon as the couple sat down, Kate was preoccupied with her phone, her head lowered, actively texting. The witness noted that Carl appeared to be doing all the talking, while Kate offered minimal engagement. She remained on her phone when they left. A detail that, while subtle, added emotional weight to the prosecution's argument, that Carl had felt rejected and had reacted to that perceived rejection in a devastating way. After leaving the pub, they walked to an embankment near the River Thames, a peaceful spot with benches that overlooked the water. What happened next would become the heart of the trial. Carl chose to testify in his own defense, a move that often carries risks. On the stand, he referred to Kate as a kind and nice woman, claiming she had seemed troubled. He insisted that he had done everything possible to help her and that he had not meant for anything tragic to occur. But this statement clashed with his earlier confession and with the forensic findings. In a dramatic courtroom moment, a member of the prosecution rolled up a piece of paper. They handed it to Carl and asked him to demonstrate in front of the judge and jury how the so-called act of self-defense had occurred. Carl refused. The presiding judge, Justice Jars Forrester, reminded him firmly that he was not in control of the courtroom and was expected to comply with the process. Still, Carl declined. "I didn't know what to do," Carl told the court. "I just stood there in awe. I was crying profusely. I lay on the grass and looked at the sky." His words stood in stark contrast to CCTV footage that later showed him at a petrol station shortly after the incident, casually purchasing just 1 pound of petrol, behavior that felt oddly detached from the emotional breakdown he described. As the trial progressed, another revelation emerged. Carl had written a letter from his cell at Staines police station addressed to Kate's family. The letter, intercepted by detectives, was never delivered, out of concern for the family's emotional well-being. In the letter, Carl wrote, "My name is Carl. I am the guy that met your daughter on Friday night. To be honest, my first impression of her was that she is a kind but unhappy girl to some respect. Anyway, for the short time I met your daughter, I began to see she was an angel, but in the dark. Even though Katie is not with us, she still shines brightly as a star in the night sky. We live in a world where life is hard for all, and those who try and embrace the good nature get rejected. Without any doubt, what I did was wrong. I don't expect, by writing you this, that I will soften your pain. But as birds sing and flowers grow in spring, remember Katie, and let the love you have and always had for her, and always will, be like the drum beats in your heart." The contents of the letter were reflective, even poetic, but ultimately rang hollow in the eyes of law enforcement. It read more like an attempt to shift the narrative than a genuine expression of remorse. After a multi-day trial, filled with testimony, evidence review, and hours of emotional tension, the jury retired to deliberate. In under 2 hours, they returned with a verdict: guilty. The courtroom reacted immediately. From the public gallery came audible sighs of relief, quiet cheers, and tears from those who had waited anxiously for justice. Carl Taylor was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 30 years before he would even be considered eligible for release. In delivering the sentence, Judge Forrester addressed Carl directly, stating, "I am satisfied that this was a murder. She was doing no more than looking to you for friendship." As the judge delivered the final words of sentencing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. There was a sense of gravity, a shared understanding that this case had shaken everyone who followed it, from investigators and court staff to members of the public and Kate's grieving family. During the sentencing, Judge Forrester did not hold back. He addressed Carl Taylor with a piercing clarity, condemning his actions and the devastating consequences they had caused. At one point, as the judge laid out his conclusions in solemn detail, Carl interrupted. He spoke quickly, trying to interject. "I didn't, Your Honor," attempting once more to cast doubt, to rewrite a version of events that had already been sealed by evidence, testimony, and a unanimous jury. But the court had heard enough. The interruption did nothing to change the outcome. The judge pressed on with his assessment, unwavering. The verdict, life imprisonment with a minimum of 30 years, brought a degree of closure to the legal chapter of this tragedy, but it could not undo the deep and lasting sorrow it had left behind. The pain of losing someone so full of promise, so deeply loved, was something that would live on in every moment for those who knew Kate. Today, the place has become a quiet memorial. Flowers now mark the spot, placed with care by friends, strangers, and those who continue to carry her memory with them. Tucked among the bouquets are handwritten notes, simple but poignant. One message read, "We miss you, Kate, and wish you were still this side of the rainbow." That sentiment, one of love and longing, speaks for many who followed the case, who watched in disbelief as the story unfolded, and who mourned a life. In the moments following the conclusion of the trial, Kate's father, Alan Beagley, stood outside the courthouse to speak to gathered reporters. His voice was steady, but his grief was undeniable. "I speak for all of us," he said, "when I say that our lives will never be the same again. Our family has been devastated, and life now seems empty and meaningless without Kate. There's a void that nothing will ever fill." His words captured the unspeakable pain of parents who had lost their only daughter. Not to illness, not to accident, but to the deliberate actions of someone who had entered her life under the pretense of friendship and then destroyed it without cause. In the aftermath of the conviction, several members of law enforcement were formally recognized for their commitment and determination. 7 detectives from Surrey Police, along with a dedicated analyst from the Metropolitan Police, received commendations for their part in unraveling a complex and emotionally charged case. Their efforts had spanned weeks of interviews, cross-force coordination, forensic examinations, and moment-by-moment analysis of surveillance and digital evidence. On May 8, 2013, a significant development occurred. The St. Paul Police Department received a call from a concerned citizen reporting a possible sighting in the Mississippi River. Authorities responded promptly. The recovery operation was conducted with great care and professionalism. The individual was then transferred to the appropriate facility for further examination. Forensic specialists utilized available records, including dental comparisons, to confirm the person's identity. The results left no room for doubt. It was Kira Steger. For her family, who had held on to hope during weeks of uncertainty, it was a heartbreaking conclusion. Because of the long searches, medical examiners were unable to determine a definitive cause of death. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. In this documentary, we explore the true story of Kira Steger, who was born on November 19, 1982, in the quiet suburb of Des Plaines, Illinois, a community nestled just outside of Chicago. She was welcomed into the world by her loving parents, Marcy and Jay Steger, who would always describe their daughter as vibrant, compassionate, and full of life. From an early age, Kira exhibited a natural charisma and deep empathy that made her beloved among family, friends, and peers. Her kindness, drive, and positive spirit shaped her into a woman who stood out wherever she went. Those who knew her often remarked on her rare ability to make people feel seen and valued, often pointing out the potential in others that they hadn't even noticed themselves. Kira eventually made her way to Minnesota, where she found employment at the Mall of America, one of the largest and most iconic shopping centers in the United States. There, she worked diligently for 2 different retail stores, becoming a trusted and respected colleague. For Kira, the workplace wasn't just about tasks and responsibilities. It was a space where she forged genuine friendships and created a second family. Her co-workers weren't just acquaintances. They were important fixtures in her daily life. They celebrated each other's victories and supported one another through challenges, creating an environment where Kira thrived both professionally and personally. Kira was known for having a keen insight into people's personalities. She often encouraged those around her to chase their dreams and to believe in themselves. She had many plans for the future, a future she envisioned as full of love, success, and personal fulfillment. With her compassionate nature and steady ambition, it seemed as though nothing could stand in her way. On Thursday, February 21, 2013, Kira was scheduled for a shift at one of the stores where she worked. Her demeanor that day was cheerful and upbeat, according to her colleagues. She had spoken about her plans to enjoy a pleasant evening out with her husband after work. It was going to be a simple dinner, perhaps followed by some time together to unwind, a typical evening for a couple sharing a routine life. At the time, Kira was married to Jeffrey Trevino. The two had met approximately 3 years earlier, and what began as a promising relationship soon blossomed into a marriage. Friends and acquaintances viewed them as a harmonious couple, with no significant signs of discord visible to the outside world. Like many couples, they experienced the occasional disagreement, but nothing that suggested serious trouble. Their issues, if any, were kept private. Even close friends and family were unaware of any major conflicts in their marriage. To all appearances, they were just another couple navigating life's usual ups and downs. But things took a strange turn just 2 days later. On Saturday, February 23rd, concern began to build when Kira failed to show up for work. Her absence was not just unusual, it was alarming. Kira was known for her punctuality, her professionalism, and her sense of responsibility. She was not the kind of person to miss a shift without notifying someone. Her colleagues immediately sensed something was wrong. When phone calls to Kira's personal number went unanswered, the worry deepened. They then reached out to her husband, Jeffrey, in hopes that he might be able to explain her whereabouts. Jeffrey responded by saying that Kira had left their home on Friday morning and had not returned since. He explained that this wasn't entirely out of character for her. According to him, Kira occasionally spent a night away from home, sometimes staying with friends or visiting family without prior notice. Although he acknowledged this behavior, he didn't express immediate concern, at least not initially. He also mentioned that there had been heavy snowfall recently, suggesting that she might have encountered car trouble or a dead phone battery, which could have caused a delay in communication. Despite his initial calm, Jeffrey eventually filed a missing persons report later that same day. He also contacted Kira's family to inform them of the situation. The news came as a shock to the Steger family. Kira was close to her relatives and remained in frequent contact with them. The idea that she would simply vanish without explanation was deeply unsettling. Her disappearance caused instant worry, triggering both emotional distress and a rapid mobilization among friends, family, and law enforcement. Law enforcement officials quickly initiated an investigation, as is standard procedure in missing person cases. The first step typically involves questioning close family members and those last seen with the individual. Detectives visited the Trevino home to speak with Jeffrey directly and to gather preliminary information. During his conversation with investigators, Jeffrey stated that he and Kira had indeed spent Thursday evening together. He described a pleasant evening: dinner, conversation, and even a game of bowling. After their outing, he said, they went home, where Kira had planned to watch a movie before turning in for the night. Jeffrey told detectives that the following morning, Friday, February 22nd, Kira left the house around 8:30 a.m. He claimed she had mentioned an important event at work that required her presence. According to him, she seemed perfectly normal, calm, focused, and acting in a way that didn't raise any red flags. He reiterated that it wasn't unusual for her to go off on her own for brief periods, and that, although they had been experiencing some relationship challenges in recent months, nothing appeared seriously wrong to him. He described their problems as minor, the kind of routine disagreements any married couple might face. Investigators pressed further, asking whether Kira might have chosen to stay elsewhere or whether there was any chance she could have been seeing someone else. Jeffrey firmly denied any such possibility. He explained that he had addressed that question with Kira in the past, and she had reassured him that there was no one else. He maintained that he trusted her and still loved her deeply. While continuing to question Jeffrey, detectives disseminated Kira's information to local patrol officers and nearby agencies. Flyers with her photo and details were distributed, and law enforcement began combing through local traffic and surveillance footage. In their quest for leads, officers also visited the Mall of America. They hoped to verify Jeffrey's account of the couple's timeline and to speak with anyone who might have seen Kira on the day she vanished. The Mall of America, located in Bloomington, Minnesota. It spans millions of square feet, housing hundreds of retail stores, restaurants, entertainment venues, and attractions. Because of the sheer size and volume of foot traffic it receives daily, security at the mall is handled with great care and vigilance. Naturally, the facility is outfitted with an extensive network of surveillance cameras, strategically placed both inside and outside, ensuring nearly every corner is monitored for public safety. With this in mind, investigators turned their attention to the video surveillance footage from February 21, the last confirmed date Kira Steger was seen by those close to her. They carefully reviewed hours of recordings to pinpoint the time she finished her shift. As expected, the cameras revealed Kira exiting her place of work as scheduled. Nothing in her behavior appeared unusual or hurried. Not long afterward, her husband, Jeffrey Trevino, appeared in the footage. The video showed the couple meeting up at the mall, spending time together in what seemed to be a casual, ordinary evening. There were no visible signs of distress, disagreement, or conflict between them. They walked calmly through the complex, eventually making their way to the parking lot. The couple then departed in their vehicle. The footage confirmed Jeffrey's initial account. Everything looked normal. However, in situations involving a missing person, the absence of suspicious activity does not necessarily bring comfort. As the hours turned into days with no word from Kira, the anxiety within her family escalated rapidly. The emotional toll was visible. The pain of not knowing her whereabouts, combined with the feeling of helplessness, created a tormenting atmosphere. Each day that passed without new information brought growing fear and sorrow. The silence was unbearable. Eventually, overwhelmed by concern and driven by a need to take action, Kira's family made the decision to travel to Bloomington to join the search efforts in person. Once there, they coordinated with authorities but also began their own grassroots campaign to raise awareness about Kira's disappearance. They had dozens of missing person flyers printed, each bearing Kira's photo and descriptive details. These were posted on lampposts, storefronts, and community boards. Family members handed out the flyers to pedestrians and passers-by on the street, asking anyone if they had seen or heard from her. Their hope was that someone, somewhere, might come forward with a lead, no matter how small, that could help bring Kira home. While the family was making every possible effort on the ground, the investigators were continuing their own thorough examination of all available leads. They began conducting interviews with neighbors who lived near the Trevino residence. During this process, one of the officers observed a residential security camera mounted on the home of a neighbor whose house faced part of the Trevino's property. The camera was not static. It had a motorized function that allowed it to rotate from side to side, covering a wide range of angles. Investigators asked the homeowner for permission to access the footage from that camera, hopeful that it might provide previously unseen details, perhaps capturing any late-night activity or unusual movement outside the home. Simultaneously, investigators received Kira's mobile phone records from her service provider. These digital records opened a new chapter in the investigation. As they combed through her call logs and text history, they discovered that Kira had been involved in an emotionally significant relationship with another individual besides her husband. The man's name was Ryan Wendt, a professional acquaintance who worked as a manager for the same chain of stores that employed Kira. Their connection, it turned out, was not a casual one. The correspondence between Kira and Ryan was frequent, deeply personal, and stretched back for a considerable period of time. This revelation added complexity to the case and introduced a potential new angle for investigators to explore. At the time of Kira's disappearance, Ryan was reportedly on a road trip driving out of state toward Colorado. Given the nature of his relationship with Kira and the timing of his travel, authorities considered it important to investigate his activities further. It wasn't clear if his trip had anything to do with Kira's disappearance, but the timing could not be dismissed outright. Investigators needed to be certain. Was his relocation merely coincidental, or was there something more to it? Efforts were made to reach Ryan Wendt, and eventually, authorities contacted him while he was en route through South Dakota. He agreed to meet with law enforcement and answered questions in Colorado, where he had traveled. During this interview, he confirmed that he had last communicated with Kira via text messages while on the road. These messages were exchanged just before Kira was last seen. According to the records, their final interaction occurred while she was dining out with her husband, indicating that she had remained in contact with Ryan during her last known hours. Investigators reviewed Ryan's phone data, including GPS locations tied to cell towers and credit card transactions, to verify his whereabouts. Everything corroborated his account. He was indeed far from Minnesota on the evening of February 21. There was no evidence placing him near Kira's location, and his phone's activity showed a consistent travel path out of state. As a result, authorities officially cleared Ryan Wendt of any involvement. He was no longer considered a suspect or person of interest. Still, one key detail lingered. The text conversation between Kira and Ryan had continued well into the night. Records showed that they exchanged messages up until approximately 11:44 p.m. on February 21. After that, Kira's phone went silent. There were no further outgoing messages, calls, or app activity. It was as if the device had simply gone offline, or been turned off entirely. As that timeline was being examined, a separate team of investigators turned their attention back to the neighbor's surveillance footage. The rotating camera offered sweeping coverage of the residential street where Kira and Jeffrey lived. However, there was one notable limitation. The camera's motorized rotation occurred at fairly rapid intervals. While this allowed it to scan a wide area quickly, it also meant that any suspicious or fleeting event could be missed in an instant. Investigators had to be extremely patient and meticulous, pausing and reviewing the footage frame by frame in hopes of catching anything significant. Even a glimpse, a shadow, a car, a figure, could provide a crucial piece of evidence. But with the camera rotating every few seconds, observation required a trained eye and great care to ensure nothing went overlooked. During one brief sweep, the lens managed to catch a partial view of the house for just a few seconds before continuing its programmed rotation to the right, leaving investigators with very limited visual data. While this footage was valuable, its quick pans and low resolution made it difficult to extract detailed information. Yet even with such constraints, detectives continued combing through the video frame by frame, hoping to uncover moments that might provide clarity. Jeffrey Trevino had shared with investigators his recollection of the night in question. According to his version of events, after he and Kira spent the evening enjoying a meal and a few games of bowling at the mall, they returned home. Once there, he said, they watched a movie together before eventually going to bed. This description painted a peaceful and uneventful evening between husband and wife. However, investigators remained cautious. They knew that memories could be selective, or in some cases, deliberately altered. As they reviewed the neighbor's footage, a detail caught their attention. Around 2 a.m., the camera recorded what appeared to be Kira's white Chevrolet reversing into the Trevino driveway. The exact sequence of what happened next was difficult to interpret. Due to the low video quality and the constant movement of the camera, there was little clarity. Nevertheless, within a short time, the vehicle was seen leaving the property once again. Investigators needed to know more. When asked about this nocturnal drive, Jeffrey explained that Kira had reminded him to refuel her car so it would be ready for her morning commute. He said that's why he took the car out in the middle of the night. Surprisingly, this part of his account proved to be accurate. Surveillance video from a local gas station confirmed that Jeffrey was indeed present there around 3:30 a.m. This discovery validated part of his story, but it also raised new questions. Most notably, why, after finishing up at the gas station, did Jeffrey not return directly home? Investigators traced his movements and found that instead of driving straight back to his residence, Jeffrey took a route that led him toward the highway. That unexpected detour sparked suspicion. The footage from the neighbor's camera did not capture him returning home, though this could have been due to the camera's rotation schedule. Because the camera only faced the house periodically, it was entirely plausible that he came back during a moment when it was pointed elsewhere. Still, the question of where he went and why remained unanswered. Further review of the surveillance footage yielded another notable moment. At precisely 9:21 a.m. on the morning following the couple's evening out, Kira's Chevrolet was seen leaving the driveway once more. Unfortunately, the angle of the camera did not provide a clear view of who was behind the wheel. With no clear visual on the driver, investigators were left in the dark about who had taken the car or what their destination might have been. Later that same day, on Saturday, February 23rd, Kira's employer reported her absence, prompting Jeffrey to file an official missing persons report. It wasn't until Monday, February 25th, however, that a new and significant development came to light. Bloomington police received a phone call from security personnel at the Mall of America. The call concerned a vehicle that had been parked in one of the mall's expansive, multi-level parking structures for several days without being moved. The guards had grown suspicious of the unmoved vehicle and contacted a towing company to have it removed. As per standard procedure, the tow truck driver conducted a brief external inspection of the vehicle before preparing it for transport. It was during this check that the driver noticed something unusual. There were unclear, smudged markings on the trunk lid that seemed out of place. Following his instincts, he chose to report the vehicle to authorities before towing it. Responding officers soon confirmed that the car was registered to Kira Steger. The discovery of Kira's vehicle deepened the gravity of the situation. Investigators conducted a careful examination of the car's interior and surrounding area. Inside the vehicle, they found Kira's handbag. Among its contents were printed documents, divorce forms, apparently downloaded from an online source. This unexpected detail revealed a potential change in Kira's personal circumstances, suggesting that there may have been unresolved tension in her marriage that had not been fully disclosed to friends or family. Even more troubling was the discovery made just behind the vehicle. Lying partially concealed in the slush and ice was a dark, rolled-up trunk mat. When investigators turned it over, they found discoloration that warranted further analysis. The mat was sent for testing, and when the DNA results came back, they confirmed that the genetic material belonged to Kira. This was a somber and heartbreaking development. While her physical whereabouts remained unknown, the implication of what had happened was becoming clearer. For Kira's family and friends, this moment marked a painful turning point. Up until then, there had still been a sliver of hope that Kira might return safely. That hope, though faint, was precious. The discovery of her vehicle and the presence of biological evidence within it extinguished that last glimmer. A wave of grief washed over those who knew and loved her, now burdened not only with loss but also with a host of unanswered questions. What had happened to her? Who had last seen her? And who could have harbored such animosity? From a law enforcement perspective, the case took on a new urgency. The top priority was now identifying the individual who had left the car at the mall. If they could determine who had been behind the wheel when the car left the Trevino residence at 9:21 a.m., they might get closer to unraveling the truth. Surveillance footage from the parking facility was reviewed. While the specific garage where the vehicle was discovered did not have coverage inside, there was a security camera trained on the road leading into the lot. That camera provided a useful lead. It recorded the white Chevrolet arriving at the lot shortly after 9:40 a.m. A few minutes later, a person appeared in the frame. The individual was dressed in a hoodie, their face obscured by the hood. Given the cold February weather, the outfit didn't raise immediate red flags, but the timing of their appearance, just after the car arrived, prompted scrutiny. The person was seen walking calmly away from the lot, crossing a street nearby and approaching a line of taxicabs stationed along the curb. After a brief conversation with one of the drivers, the individual got into a cab and was driven away. Investigators saw an opportunity to trace the person's movements further. If they could determine which taxi company operated the cab, they might be able to identify the driver, confirm where the passenger had been dropped off, and, potentially, learn the identity of the person who had last been with Kira's vehicle. By cross-referencing the time and location of the pickup with transportation records, police were able to identify the taxi company that operated cabs in that zone. Using the timestamp from the footage that captured a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt speaking briefly with a taxi driver outside the shopping center, investigators were able to move swiftly. Identifying the vehicle involved in that encounter wasn't difficult. Each of the cabs operating in the area was part of a regulated fleet equipped with modern tracking technology, including GPS systems that recorded every stop, route, and trip duration. Police traced the specific cab based on time and location. The GPS data showed that the individual in the hooded sweatshirt was dropped off just a short walking distance, approximately 1 block, from the home shared by Kira and Jeffrey Trevino. The ride had been paid for in cash, which is less traceable than a card payment, but the digital trail left behind by the cab's tracking system more than compensated for the lack of financial data. This passenger's behavior seemed deliberate, and investigators were beginning to build a detailed timeline of the movements in the hours after Kira's vehicle had been left at the parking structure. As the cab exited the neighborhood, its image was captured by the same neighbor's rotating surveillance camera that had earlier provided glimpses of the Trevino home. Just 2 minutes after the cab disappeared from view, the camera caught another figure entering the frame. A hooded man walking alone down the street. The grainy footage made it difficult to make out his facial features, but one detail stood out clearly. A white stylized logo displayed prominently on the front of the sweatshirt. Investigators watched as the man continued walking and ultimately entered the Trevino residence. Given the timeline of Kira's disappearance and the proximity of the person's drop-off point to the home, detectives began to develop a strong theory that the man in the footage was none other than Jeffrey Trevino himself. With enough preliminary evidence to justify it, investigators obtained a search warrant for the house. When law enforcement officers entered the property, the initial impression was that of a typical, well-kept suburban home. Nothing unusual or disorderly on the surface. But seasoned investigators knew that appearances could be misleading. What stood out to them were subtle yet significant signs that the house had recently been cleaned, especially in the couple's shared bedroom. Furniture appeared slightly rearranged, and certain areas smelled faintly of industrial cleaning agents. The forensic team began their examination, bringing in specialized equipment and chemicals to assist in identifying trace evidence invisible to the naked eye. When they applied luminol to the bedroom floor, the results were stark. The chemical reacted strongly, causing areas of the carpet to emit a bright blue glow, evidence that the DNA had been recently cleaned or scrubbed. Samples were collected and sent to a lab for DNA testing. The results confirmed the presence of Kira Steger's DNA throughout the premises, leaving investigators with no doubt that everything happened inside the house. This finding dramatically altered the direction of the case. Kira was no longer considered simply a missing person. Law enforcement now had enough evidence. As the investigation deepened, detectives turned their attention to Jeffrey's vehicle. Although a visual inspection of the car did not immediately reveal signs of a struggle or visible evidence, a more detailed search turned up an item of interest: a receipt tucked inside the car. It had been issued by a local gas station roughly 1 hour and 40 minutes before Kira's car was abandoned at the shopping center parking lot. The timestamp on the receipt was critical. It placed Jeffrey in motion during a key window of time. Detectives visited the gas station listed on the receipt and requested surveillance footage from that morning. The video confirmed what the receipt suggested. Jeffrey Trevino was recorded at the station filling his tank. Afterward, he walked into the store and used an ATM to withdraw cash. The camera captured a clear shot of his face and, more importantly, showed him wearing a jacket that bore a distinctive chess logo, an insignia matching the one seen on the hoodie worn by the figure caught on surveillance near the shopping center. This connection between time, place, clothing, and behavior strengthened the investigative case. Law enforcement now had surveillance footage, physical evidence, and a timeline that placed Jeffrey in key locations before and after Kira's car was discovered. With these elements in place, police moved forward and officially placed 39-year-old Jeffrey Trevino under arrest. He was transported to the station for formal questioning and designated the prime suspect in the case. Upon arrival, Jeffrey chose to exercise his legal rights. He contacted his attorney almost immediately and, under legal counsel, declined to answer investigators' questions. While his silence was legally protected, it did little to dispel the weight of the evidence accumulating against him. Even so, for investigators, one critical piece remained missing: the location of Kira's. Until her were found, there was still an element of doubt that could be used in a legal defense. In the weeks that followed, law enforcement, community volunteers, and members of Kira's family conducted ongoing searches across multiple areas in and around St. Paul. They combed through parks, trails, wooded areas, and lake shores. In late March, roughly a month after Kira was last seen, a group of volunteers made a discovery near Keller Lake, located just a few miles from the Trevino residence. Resting near the roadside was a weathered bag that looked out of place. Inside, investigators found a pillow and a shirt. These items were carefully collected and sent for testing. Laboratory analysis revealed that Kira's DNA was present on the materials, confirming that the items had belonged to her or had been in contact with her. This discovery increased the urgency of the search in the area surrounding the lake. At the time, however, heavy ice still covered much of Keller Lake, which complicated dive efforts. Law enforcement brought in search and rescue divers trained in cold water recovery. Despite their efforts, the underwater search yielded no results. On land, search dogs were deployed in the surrounding forest and shoreline. But again, no further evidence was located. It wasn't until May 8, 2013, 2.5 months after Kira's disappearance, that a major breakthrough occurred. The St. Paul Police Department received a call from a concerned citizen. The caller reported seeing what looked like a person floating in the Mississippi River. Responding officers arrived quickly and confirmed that the report was valid. The recovery operation was handled with care, and the evidence were transported for examination. Forensic teams worked with dental records to make a formal identification. The results left no uncertainty. It was Kira Steger. Her family, who had clung to hope even through the most difficult days, were now confronted with the heartbreaking confirmation. Because of the long searches, medical examiners were unable to determine a definitive cause of death. This lack of a conclusive forensic explanation added complexity to the legal process, but the cumulative body of evidence, circumstantial, digital, and forensic, was compelling. Based on the physical timeline established through cell phone records, GPS data, video surveillance, and the forensic discovery of Kira's personal belongings, detectives began formulating a detailed theory. They speculated that the events likely took a drastic turn shortly after Kira and Jeffrey returned home out on February 21st. Afterward, evidence suggested that Jeffrey took a series of calculated steps in an effort to conceal what had happened. According to police, he used Kira's vehicle to transport her personal belongings and possibly other items away from their home. That same night, records confirmed that Jeffrey visited a gas station around 3:30 a.m., where he not only fueled the car, but also withdrew cash from an ATM, an action that would later prove significant. Investigators believed that the cash was withdrawn in preparation for a taxi ride the following morning. This foresight indicated an attempt to cover his tracks by avoiding digital payments that could later be traced. The following morning, the timeline continued to build. At 9:21 a.m., Kira's Chevrolet was seen leaving the driveway of the Trevino home. Surveillance footage later captured it entering the parking structure near the Mall of America, where it was left abandoned. Once home, it appeared that Jeffrey spent the remainder of the day attempting to clean and sanitize areas of the house. Investigators believed this was an effort to create the illusion that nothing unusual had happened, and that Kira had simply left for work as usual that morning. The implication was clear. Jeffrey had hoped to construct a narrative in which Kira left on her own, never to return, with her vehicle left behind at her place of employment to support the story. But the thorough work of law enforcement and the many surveillance cameras in place ultimately unraveled that version of events. By the time the case went to trial in the fall of 2013, the prosecution had built a compelling case grounded in surveillance data, digital forensics, DNA evidence, and behavioral patterns. In October 2013, after careful deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Jeffrey Trevino, then 39 years old, was found guilty. However, the jury accepted the defense's argument that his actions were not premeditated in nature. Judge Leonardo Castro announced the formal sentence. Jeffrey Trevino was sentenced to 27.5 years in prison. Under Minnesota law, Trevino would be eligible for supervised release after serving a portion of his sentence. Based on current calculations, his earliest possible parole eligibility date would be sometime in the year 2031. A team of investigators was already on the way to the house, this time for an official and thorough search of the property. But this wasn't just another routine check. Now, the investigators had solid leads. Clues had been carefully gathered and pieced together, pointing them to very specific areas of interest. Their focus shifted to the basement, a space that suddenly held new weight and meaning. Down there, something immediately caught their attention, a section of the concrete floor that looked freshly sealed. In the far corner, barely illuminated by the overhead bulb, stood a raised cement platform. It looked completely out of place. The construction didn't match the rest of the basement, and the materials used appeared oddly inconsistent. Something was off. The team knew this was the place they needed to dig deeper. As they began a careful search of the area, their suspicions were confirmed. That's when they found Lisa Mitchell. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Lisa Mitchell was born on a warm summer day, August 5th, 1983, in the city of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. From her earliest days, Lisa was a bright, spirited child, often described by those who knew her as imaginative, curious, and full of energy. Her parents noticed her creative streak when she was just a toddler. She would sit for hours with crayons and markers, doodling everything from animals to imaginary worlds, showing a depth of focus rare in children her age. By the age of 4, Lisa had already found a deep love for drawing. Her room was often filled with sketchbooks, coloring pages, and art supplies scattered across the floor. This passion wasn't just a passing phase. It became a defining part of her personality. As she grew, so did her range of interests. In junior high, she joined an after-school art club, and by high school, her creativity had expanded beyond visual arts. She discovered music and fell in love with it almost instantly. With a few close friends, she started a small band where she sang vocals and occasionally played guitar. It was never about fame for Lisa. It was about expression, emotion, and connection. Despite her artistic talents, Lisa's path after high school wasn't straightforward. Upon graduation, she made the practical decision to delay college. She needed to work and support herself financially, especially since her family couldn't afford to fund post-secondary education. For the next few years, she juggled various part-time jobs, from waiting tables at local diners to working retail in downtown Calgary. Life was not easy, but Lisa faced each challenge with quiet resilience. One evening, while working a dinner shift at a mid-range restaurant, she met a man named Alan. He was charming, easygoing, and seemed to genuinely appreciate Lisa's warmth and sense of humor. Their relationship started casually, but it didn't take long before they were inseparable. A few years into their relationship, they welcomed 2 children, a boy first, followed by a little girl. The young couple eventually moved into a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping to build a peaceful life for their growing family. For a while, everything appeared stable. Lisa shifted her focus to raising the children and working evening shifts at a nearby hotel, a job she enjoyed especially because her mother also worked there. The 2 women often shared shifts and became known among coworkers for their close bond and positive attitudes. Life settled into a routine, one filled with everyday moments: school drop-offs, dinner prep, bedtime stories. But beneath the surface, not everything was perfect. On the night of October 27, 2012, Lisa headed to work as usual. It was a special evening. The hotel was hosting a Halloween-themed event, and the atmosphere was festive and upbeat. Guests arrived in costume, music played throughout the building, and Lisa and her mom enjoyed themselves as they managed the crowd. After the event ended and their shift wrapped up, Lisa made a decision to stay the night at her mom's house instead of making the long drive home. It wasn't unusual. She'd done it before when work ran late. The following morning, as they sipped coffee and chatted about the previous night's festivities, Lisa received a phone call. It was brief, but afterward, she quickly announced she needed to leave. She didn't offer much explanation, just that something had come up and she needed to get back home. Her mom, though slightly puzzled, didn't press her. Lisa hugged her goodbye, walked to her car, and drove off. That would be the last time her mother saw her in person. At first, there was no cause for alarm. Lisa was an independent woman, and sometimes she got busy. But as days passed with no calls or texts, a nagging worry began to grow. Lisa always checked in, especially with her mom. A day or 2 without contact was rare, but a whole week was unheard of. Concerned, her mother began calling, each time reaching voicemail. She reassured herself with excuses. Lisa was probably just swamped with work or dealing with the kids. Still, the silence felt heavier with each passing day. Eventually, unable to ignore her instincts, Lisa's mom drove to her daughter's house. When she arrived, Alan answered the door. He looked calm, but his words did little to ease her fears. He claimed that the day after Lisa left her mother's place, October 28th, they had a disagreement. He said he stepped out briefly to buy cigarettes, and when he returned, Lisa was gone. She had, according to him, left without a word. But something about his account didn't sit right. As she stood in the hallway talking to Alan, Lisa's mother happened to glance at the coat rack by the door. Hanging there were Lisa's winter coat and boots. It was late October in Calgary, already cold. Lisa would never have left without them. Her daughter was practical and cautious, especially when it came to the weather. Even more unsettling, as she continued looking around, she found Lisa's favorite bracelet and necklace sitting untouched on her dresser. These weren't items Lisa would leave behind if she were planning to be away, even briefly. They were sentimental, almost symbolic. Things she wore every time she stepped out. However, her purse was nowhere to be found. Before she left the house, Alan mentioned something else. Lisa had sent him an email. He suggested her mom check her inbox as well. That night, back at home, she turned on the computer and opened her email. To her surprise, there was indeed a message from Lisa. The tone was vague, almost generic. Lisa wrote that she was feeling overwhelmed and needed time to herself. She promised to be okay and asked not to be worried. Over the following weeks, more emails trickled in. They were sporadic and somewhat inconsistent, always calm, always insisting that she was fine, but never offering any details. When asked directly where she was or why she left so abruptly, Lisa avoided answering. It was unlike her, and that only deepened the worry. Then came the voicemail. On the morning of November 16th, Lisa's mom woke up and checked her phone to find a missed call. It had come in at 2:45 a.m. from Lisa's number. There was a voicemail. For a moment, she felt relieved. Lisa had reached out. But as she played the message, her relief turned to confusion, then concern. Lisa's voice was there, unmistakably hers. But something about the message was strange. Her words were disjointed, rushed, and hard to follow. "Hey, I'm okay. Sometimes my weeks get crazy, you know, and it was quiet for a while. And then all of a sudden this happened, and within half a day I should, but he's back now, and I got to go. Love you." It was as if she had been interrupted while recording it. There were pauses in strange places. Her tone shifted halfway through. And most disturbingly, the message raised more questions than it answered. Who was he? What had happened so suddenly? Why couldn't she explain? Her mother replayed the message over and over, trying to make sense of it. But clarity never came. She held on to the hope that Lisa was safe, somewhere, sorting things out. But deep down, the uncertainty lingered, and the sense that something was terribly wrong. That was the moment Lisa's mother knew she couldn't wait in silence any longer. Too much time had passed without a single real word from her daughter. Strange emails and one confusing voicemail were not enough. So she did what any mother would do. She went to the police. Sitting in a quiet, wood-paneled office at the local precinct, Lisa's mom recounted everything. She laid it all out, from the last time she saw Lisa to the strange behavior from Alan, the unsettling message on her voicemail, and the unanswered questions about her daughter's disappearance. The detective on duty took careful notes and promised to open a formal investigation. When investigators began their inquiries, it didn't take long before a more complicated picture of Lisa and Alan's relationship began to surface. What had once seemed like a relatively stable home life was, in truth, riddled with turbulence. Through interviews with friends and extended family, it became clear that Lisa and Alan had a long and difficult history. Even before their children were born, the relationship had been a series of ups and downs. Frequent breakups followed by reconciliations, moments of hope eclipsed by repeating patterns of disappointment. Initially, parenthood seemed to calm things. Their focus shifted to their children, and for a time, things appeared to be on steadier ground. But under the surface, deeper frustrations had started to form, particularly for Lisa. As the years passed, she had taken on the heavy weight of being the primary breadwinner. While Alan struggled to maintain consistent employment, Lisa was the one holding everything together. She worked long hours, often in multiple jobs, while still managing most of the responsibilities at home. The stress built up over time, eroding whatever trust and connection remained between them. At one point, Lisa even confided to a close friend that she was seriously considering ending the relationship. But she stayed, mainly for the children, who she loved more than anything. Eventually, detectives brought Alan in for questioning. Sitting across from them, he was calm, composed, and unusually forthcoming. He didn't deny that the relationship had been strained. In fact, he admitted that in recent years, he and Lisa had made a mutual decision to stay together purely for the sake of their kids. According to Alan, their emotional connection had faded, and both of them had essentially been living separate lives under the same roof. What raised some eyebrows, however, was Alan's claim that Lisa had started seeing other men on occasion. He didn't seem particularly upset about it, more resigned than anything else. It wasn't a secret, he told investigators. We both knew it. We weren't pretending to be in love anymore. Still, he insisted that he had no idea where Lisa had gone. He admitted he was surprised that she would just vanish without a trace, but said what confused him most was how she could leave their 2 children behind. Police soon turned their attention to the house the couple had shared. A team conducted a thorough search, combing through each room for anything that might offer answers. But there were no signs of foul play, no immediate evidence to suggest Lisa had been harmed or forced to leave. The home was tidy, almost eerily so. Investigators hoped Lisa's digital footprint might reveal more. They seized her personal laptop and examined her email, message history, and social media accounts. That's when they found something that piqued their interest. Among Lisa's saved conversations were ongoing chats with several different men, many of whom lived outside the province, and in some cases, across the country. These communications weren't explicit or overly personal, but they hinted at the possibility that Lisa may have been building connections elsewhere, perhaps even planning to leave Calgary altogether. Investigators reached out to each of the men, but every single one told them the same thing. They hadn't seen Lisa and had no idea where she had gone. None of them had hosted her or heard from her around the time of her disappearance. The detective team also looked into the strange email address that had been contacting Lisa's mother. It had sent multiple reassurances over the weeks following Lisa's disappearance, always insisting that Lisa was safe, just taking time for herself. The phone number that had placed the late-night voicemail was next on the list. Investigators tried tracing both, but neither led to any useful information. The email account had been set up through a free provider using a fake name. The number was registered to a prepaid cell phone with no contract or owner information. It was a dead end. In the months that followed, the case remained open but grew colder with each passing week. Flyers were posted, articles written, and Lisa's story was shared on local news stations. Yet, not a single credible tip surfaced. Slowly, the stream of emails to Lisa's mom stopped. The inbox that had once offered hope now became a haunting reminder of everything she didn't know. As the months slipped into a full year, Lisa's mother found herself returning to a painful suspicion, one that had taken root early on, but which she had tried hard to push away. What if Alan knew more than he was letting on? She mentioned it to the police more than once, but every time, they gave her the same answer. They had no solid evidence that pointed to Alan being involved. Without concrete proof, they couldn't move forward with any charges or deeper investigation against him. Meanwhile, Alan's life took a different turn. With Lisa gone, he became a full-time single parent. He eventually found stable work at a new car dealership opening on the edge of the city. The owner was looking for motivated staff, and Alan, needing to provide for his children, stepped into the opportunity. Over time, his routine normalized. The dealership owner's girlfriend began helping occasionally with childcare, watching the kids when Alan worked late. It gave him a bit of breathing room, and slowly, things began to look up. Nearly 2 years passed. Alan seemed to be adjusting, even moving on. He had stopped talking about Lisa altogether. Then, something unexpected happened. On a snowy evening in early winter, while pulling out of a parking lot after work, Alan's car was rear-ended. The other driver, a woman, had lost control due to the icy conditions. No one was hurt, and the damage was minimal. She apologized repeatedly and assured Alan that her employer's insurance would cover the cost of repairs. As a peace offering, she handed him a pair of tickets to a local hockey game. They exchanged numbers and stayed in touch. Eventually, the two began to see each other casually. For the first time in a long while, Alan considered the idea of building a future with someone new. Then, In December 2014, just over 2 years after Lisa was last seen, Alan went on a short work trip with 2 co-workers. They had traveled to a nearby city for a dealership conference. While relaxing in the hotel lobby, Alan's phone rang. The call came from a number he didn't recognize. On the other end of the line was a man who introduced himself as a detective. He explained that he had recently been assigned to Lisa's case and was now the lead investigator. There was a pause, and then the detective spoke carefully. "We have reason to believe Lisa is no longer alive," he said, "and we've obtained a warrant to search your home again. In fact, our team is already en route." Alan's co-workers, who were sitting with him at the time, later recalled the change in his expression. In an instant, his face went pale, his hands trembling slightly as he set the phone down. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he quietly asked for a cigarette, despite having quit months before, and told his colleagues, "I think I need to talk to you." Alan sat quietly for a long moment, his hands clenched together, his mind racing. Then, in a flat, almost mechanical tone, he began to talk. He told his co-workers that 2 years earlier, on a seemingly ordinary day, he and Lisa had gotten into yet another argument. He couldn't even recall what had started it. Maybe it was something trivial, something small. But as was often the case with them, small disagreements could spiral out of control quickly. Emotions ran high. Words were exchanged. And then, according to Alan, everything became a blur. He described the moment as if it had happened outside of time. The next, Lisa was lying motionless, and the reality of what had happened began to set in. Alan claimed that what followed was not premeditated. It was panic, pure and simple. He said he felt overwhelmed and frozen with fear. The weight of what had just occurred crashed down on him, and instead of calling for help, instead of explaining or seeking support, he made a decision, one he now believed he couldn't take back. He decided to make it look like Lisa had simply walked away. After telling the story, Alan turned to one of his co-workers, a man he had come to trust over time. Alan remembered that this colleague had once shared a deeply personal experience from his past, something tragic. Years ago, the co-worker had been involved in a drunk driving accident. He crashed his car, and tragically, his friend, who had been riding with him, didn't survive. The memory haunted him, but it also gave him a unique perspective on panic, consequence, and regret. Alan, now consumed by his own crisis, looked to him for guidance. With trembling fingers, Alan started laying out possible options. His thoughts were disorganized, bouncing from one idea to the next. He considered disappearing entirely, leaving his old life behind and running somewhere far away. He thought maybe, just maybe, if he could get ahead of the situation, he could escape the consequences. At one point, he floated the idea of hiring a lawyer to block the warrant, though he admitted he didn't think there was enough time. Then, almost in passing, he mentioned something darker, wondering aloud whether burning down the house would destroy any remaining evidence. But almost immediately, he dismissed the thought, acknowledging that a fire likely wouldn't cover everything and would only draw more suspicion. In the end, Alan seemed to settle on one thing: fleeing might be his only chance. His co-workers, caught between disbelief and loyalty, didn't try to stop him. Some even agreed that disappearing could be his best bet. Alan began mapping out where he might go, how quickly he could leave, and whether anyone would help him. He had no idea, however, that time had already run out. What he believed to be a private conversation, shared among friends, was already too late to matter. Because that phone call he'd received from the detective? It hadn't just been a routine notification about a warrant. It was the final act in a year-long, tightly orchestrated police operation. Every word Alan spoke afterward would ultimately work against him. Behind the scenes, law enforcement had been working on Lisa's case with renewed intensity. In 2013, the province of Alberta implemented a new set of legal tools under its revised missing persons legislation. These updates gave investigators greater authority to gather evidence in prolonged disappearance cases, especially those with suspicious circumstances. Lisa's case was among the first to benefit from the new approach. When her file was reassigned to a newly assembled task force, they began building the case from scratch, methodically re-examining everything that had once seemed like a dead end. Their first breakthrough came from examining Lisa's final known phone activity. That strange voicemail Lisa's mother had received late one night. Investigators were finally able to access the phone data. They discovered that it had originated from a disposable prepaid cell phone, a device that had only been active for a short window after Lisa went missing. In fact, the phone had only ever placed 5 calls in total, 1 to Lisa's mom and 4 others to Alan. This detail raised immediate red flags. Alan had never once mentioned receiving calls from the mystery number. Not only was that omission suspicious, it strongly suggested he had information he hadn't shared. But even more damning was the location of the calls. All 5 originated from the same cell tower, one that served the area near the house Lisa and Alan had shared. If Lisa had really left town, there would be no reason for her phone activity to remain rooted in her old neighborhood. Now on high alert, investigators decided to dig deeper into Alan's financial history. What they found next pushed the case into new territory. On the exact day Lisa was last seen, Alan had made a series of purchases at various local stores. They weren't the kind of items most people would buy on the same day. A large plastic storage bin, bleach, rubber gloves, wooden boards, cement mix, a heavy-duty bucket, and perhaps most oddly, several bags of cat litter. The last item seemed especially strange. According to everyone who knew Alan well, he was severely allergic to cats. He didn't own one, and he couldn't even be around them without experiencing strong allergic reactions. So, why the cat litter? The list of purchases taken together suggested a troubling possibility. But troubling as it was, it still wasn't enough to bring charges. They needed something more, something undeniable. Then came the next big discovery. Investigators were able to match the prepaid phone's model to one sold at a local Walmart. Records showed that a phone matching that exact model had been purchased with Alan's debit card just weeks after Lisa vanished. The trail was tightening. Still, detectives knew circumstantial evidence wouldn't hold up in court. To make their case truly solid, they needed either a confession or a body. And so, a bold and elaborate plan was put into motion. A covert operation that would insert undercover officers directly into Alan's life. The mission was given a code name, Operation Aurora, and it would become one of the most carefully orchestrated sting operations in the province's recent history. The first move came quietly. A female undercover officer was tasked with creating a natural, believable encounter with Alan. After carefully observing his routines, she found an opportunity. One day, while Alan was backing out of a parking space, she lightly bumped his car. It was minor, no damage, but it created a reason to talk. She apologized, they exchanged a few friendly words, and she offered to cover any minor repair cost. Over time, the conversation evolved into a casual friendship. A few weeks later, she introduced Alan to a friend, another undercover officer. This man was posing as an entrepreneur opening a new car dealership, and he offered Alan a position on the sales team. Alan, eager to stabilize his life, accepted quickly. What he didn't realize was that this new job and this new friendship had been designed from the very beginning to win his trust. To maintain the illusion and keep Alan fully convinced that everything around him was real, investigators went to extraordinary lengths. The fake car dealership where Alan had been hired wasn't just a backdrop, it was fully operational. From signage to inventory, customer walk-ins to staged paperwork, everything was put in place to give the appearance of a legitimate business. Nothing was left to chance. Law enforcement spared no detail, knowing that Alan was the type to notice if something didn't feel right. In fact, the undercover operation had become so embedded in Alan's world that it mirrored his actual daily routine. Multiple officers were brought in to play roles as fellow employees, customers, mechanics, and even managers. Each one was carefully selected and trained to maintain the story. They were given backstories, schedules, and personalities that made their presence convincing. Day by day, trust was built. Alan began to develop real relationships with these people. People he believed were co-workers, mentors, and friends. They shared casual conversations during breaks, swapped stories after shifts, and even celebrated small victories at work. These weren't just acquaintances. In Alan's mind, they were a community. One officer, posing as a friendly and down-to-earth employee, even introduced his girlfriend to Alan. She quickly became involved with his children, offering to babysit from time to time when Alan had to work late or attend events. Unbeknownst to him, she too was a highly trained undercover officer, one more piece in the elaborate web being spun around him. As weeks turned into months, Alan lowered his guard. He began to speak more freely, sharing personal details and vulnerabilities with the very people who were documenting everything. Detectives watching from behind the scenes agreed that the operation had reached a critical point. Alan had grown comfortable. He trusted his new circle completely. And that's when authorities knew it was time to move to the final stage of their long-term strategy. The next phase would be a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to push Alan emotionally, to create just enough pressure to cause him to slip. A mock work trip was arranged. Alan and two of the undercover officers, whom he now considered close colleagues, were sent to a different city under the pretense of scouting for a new dealership location. The setting was controlled, and the environment carefully selected to minimize risk. While Alan was out of town and in a relaxed state of mind, the lead detective placed a well-timed call. The voice on the line introduced himself calmly and professionally, saying he had just been reassigned to Lisa's case. Then came the carefully delivered message. Police had secured a new warrant to search Alan's home, and the search would begin shortly. That was all the detective said before ending the call. The plan worked exactly as intended. What Alan didn't know was that both undercover officers with him on the trip were wearing hidden recording equipment. The moment the call ended, they subtly shifted the conversation. Alan, visibly rattled, leaned forward and asked them what they thought he should do. Within minutes, he began to unravel. The sense of control he had maintained for 2 years began to fall apart in real time. His words came in fragments at first, just enough to suggest that he had something to hide. But the officers kept the dialogue going, supporting him emotionally, encouraging him to come clean and be honest. Alan took the bait. Eventually, his confession came in full. He admitted that Lisa hadn't simply disappeared. He spoke about the argument, the panic, and his decision to stage her departure. It was all captured on tape, every word recorded by the very people he believed he could trust. What he didn't realize was that the net had been closing in around him for over a year. Shortly after the confession, Alan was arrested without incident and transported back to Calgary. Meanwhile, a team of investigators was already en route to his home. This would be the second official search of the property. The first had occurred 2 years prior, shortly after Lisa was reported missing. At that time, police had combed through the residence and even the basement, but found nothing that raised alarms. This time was different. Investigators now had detailed information, specific clues pieced together from Alan's recorded admissions and past purchase records. In the basement, they focused their attention on a section of the floor that looked newly sealed. In one dimly lit corner, a raised cement platform stood out. It didn't match the layout of the rest of the room, and the material used in its construction seemed odd. The size, shape, and dimensions aligned exactly with the wooden board Alan had purchased 2 years earlier. There was no question. This spot needed to be examined further. While carefully searching the area, police located Lisa Mitchell. It was the confirmation that investigators had quietly anticipated, and with it, the case shifted from circumstantial suspicion to irrefutable fact. But what police found next complicated the narrative even more. As they continued searching through Alan's belongings, detectives examined his personal computer. Among files and emails, they found a pattern of search history that raised additional concerns. These weren't idle curiosities. They suggested a calculated effort to cover tracks. Even more telling was the revelation about the emails sent to Lisa's mother. Although they had seemed convincing at the time, assuring her that Lisa was safe, they were later traced directly back to Alan's computer. Forensic analysis confirmed that he had composed and sent the messages himself, carefully phrasing them to resemble Lisa's tone. But the most chilling discovery of all involved Lisa's cell phone. Hidden software had been installed without her knowledge, spyware that allowed Alan to monitor her conversations and record her audio in real time. Investigators found evidence that he had intercepted and edited one of her recorded calls to create the voicemail that had misled Lisa's mother. That message, the one that had caused so much confusion, had been manipulated from the start. The audio hadn't been a real-time cry for help. It had been carefully staged. This revelation directly challenged Alan's earlier claims that the incident was spontaneous. Despite the mounting evidence, securing a conviction for premeditated murder proved difficult. The timeline, though suspicious, lacked a single definitive act that clearly established planning beyond all reasonable doubt. In the end, prosecutors agreed to a plea deal. Alan was charged with second-degree murder, a decision that allowed for a lesser sentence but ensured a conviction. Alan's legal team advised him to accept the plea. By pleading guilty, he could avoid the risk of life imprisonment for first-degree murder. He agreed, but even then, he claimed the entire situation had been an act of self-defense. He alleged he acted out of fear. Prosecutors argued the opposite, that Alan had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up and carefully controlled the narrative for years. The judge ultimately ruled that the available evidence did not meet the threshold for second-degree murder. Alan Scheibach was found guilty of manslaughter instead, a verdict that carried a sentence of just 7 years in prison. The response was swift. Prosecutors filed an appeal, arguing that the sentence was too lenient given the scope of the deception, the efforts to mislead Lisa's family, and the emotional toll. The court reviewed the case and agreed to increase the sentence, but only by 3 years. Alan would now serve a total of 10 years. In the end, however, Alan Scheibach served just 5 years before being granted early release on parole. But his freedom didn't last long. Shortly after his release, Alan violated the terms of his parole and was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. He remained incarcerated until 2022, when he was formally released from custody. For many, the punishment felt far too light for the scale of what had happened. And yet, from a law enforcement perspective, the case was seen as a major success. A long-term, undercover operation had achieved what traditional investigative methods could not. For over a year, a dedicated team of officers had embedded themselves into Alan's life, earned his trust, and quietly built a path to the truth. March 25th, 2009. It was just before 9 a.m. on a quiet morning along Hot Springs Drive. Mitchell pulled up in his pickup truck, parked at the curb, and stepped out. Reaching the front door, he knocked. Once, then again. Silence. No answer. Something felt off. Trusting his instincts, Mitchell moved around the side of the house, heading toward the backyard. That's when he saw it, the shattered glass. But he went inside. There, inside the house, he discovered Kay Parsons. Shaken but steady, Mitchell pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The call was placed at exactly 8:47 a.m. Within minutes, deputies from the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. An ambulance wasn't far behind. Emergency responders worked swiftly and efficiently, securing the area, assessing the situation, and doing all they could to stabilize Kay before transporting her to the hospital. But despite their best efforts, precious time had already been lost. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Laverne Kay Parsons came into the world in February 1968, born in the quiet, close-knit communities of Pennsylvania. She grew up surrounded by the rolling hills and crisp winters of the Laurel Highlands, a place where everyone seemed to know each other's names, and high school football games could turn strangers into lifelong friends. That's where she met David, the boy who would become her best friend, her first love, and eventually, her husband. They weren't just a high school couple. They were the high school couple, the kind of young love that teachers smiled at and friends quietly envied. As they grew older, their bond only strengthened. Kay and David married not long after graduation, determined to build something lasting together. And they did. They carved out a life with their own hands, filled with hard work, quiet victories, and a deep mutual respect. Years later, their greatest joy arrived in the form of their only son, Derek. From the very beginning, Kay was the kind of mother who seemed born for the role. She was warm but firm, nurturing yet fiercely protective. Every moment with Derek mattered. She poured her heart into raising him, not just to be successful, but to be kind. By 2005, David had transitioned out of military service and into a career as a contractor. His work eventually led them south to the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. There, they settled into a modest but comfortable home on Hot Springs Drive. It was the kind of neighborhood where American flags fluttered in the breeze, kids played basketball in driveways, and neighbors shared lawn tools without hesitation. For Kay, it was a new beginning, and she embraced it with open arms. At 41, she wasn't the kind of woman to sit idly by while life passed her. She quickly found work at a local physical therapy clinic where she helped patients recover from surgeries, injuries, and accidents. Coworkers described her as dependable, quietly competent, and endlessly compassionate. She had that rare quality of making people feel seen, understood, and respected. Her energy wasn't loud, it was steady, grounding. And though she never sought the spotlight, she was often the one quietly holding everything together behind the scenes. But if you really wanted to witness the heart of Kay Parsons, all you had to do was attend one of Derek's Little League games. She was always there, seated high in the bleachers, a cooler at her feet, and an encouraging smile ready for every player, not just her own. She organized team snacks, coordinated carpools, and cheered louder than anyone, even when the team was down by 10 runs. For many of the neighborhood kids, she became a second mom. And for Derek, she was simply everything. By 2009, Derek was 12 years old, growing fast, and just beginning to explore his independence. But he remained deeply close to his parents. Kay and David made sure their son had every opportunity they could provide. Lessons in character, not just academics. And in Grovetown, the family had truly blossomed. Their home had become a hub of community activity. Neighbors frequently gathered for weekend cookouts, impromptu tennis matches, and birthday parties where the guest list spanned multiple streets. One family in particular, the neighbors next door, had grown especially close to them. Their children played together. They shared dinners, holidays, even vacations. To outsiders, it all looked perfect. But true crime stories often begin with things that look perfect. Because sometimes, beneath the warmth of sunny sidewalks and freshly cut lawns, shadows grow unnoticed. March 25th, 2009. It was just before 9 a.m. on Hot Springs Drive. The morning sun had begun to stretch its way across Grovetown, casting soft light and long shadows over lawns still damp with dew. Most homes were quiet. Parents already gone to work. Kids dropped off at school. The air was still except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant growl of a lawnmower engine starting up. Mitchell Cart was a handyman, reliable, familiar, a fixture in the neighborhood. He'd done work for several families over the years, and on that morning, he had a job lined up at Kay Parsons' house. It was supposed to be a routine call, a bit of maintenance, something small. Kay had mentioned it to him earlier in the week. She was always polite, always appreciative. As Mitchell pulled up in his truck, the familiar sounds of his toolbox rattling in the back seemed louder than usual in the stillness. He parked, got out, and adjusted his cap before walking up the driveway to the front door. He expected Kay to answer quickly, maybe with a mug of coffee in her hand, greeting him with that casual friendliness she was known for. But when he knocked, once, then twice, there was no reply. He waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. No footsteps inside, no TV noise, just silence. He checked his watch. It was 8:45 a.m. Kay had dropped Derek off at school earlier, so she should be home. Maybe she was in the shower or in the backyard? Something didn't feel quite right. He walked around the side of the house toward the backyard, and that's when he saw it. Shattered glass from the sliding back door, glinting in the sunlight. It crunched under his boots as he stepped cautiously onto the patio. Inside, the kitchen looked wrong. An overturned chair, a drawer left hanging open. His heart rate quickened. He called out, "Hello? Kay?" But was met only with silence. What drove him forward next, instinct, concern, or dread, is hard to say. But he entered. The living room was disordered. pillows on the floor, a table slightly askew. He moved through the space until he noticed the door to the garage. He opened it. There he found Kay Parsons. Mitchell called 911 at exactly 8:47 a.m. Within minutes, Columbia County Sheriff's deputies arrived. An ambulance followed close behind. Emergency personnel worked quickly and professionally, stabilizing the scene and rushing Kay to the hospital. But despite their efforts, time was slipping away. What began as an ordinary Wednesday morning had become something else entirely, something far more chilling. And soon the realization began to settle over the neighborhood. This was no random break-in. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or an accident. This was something else. Someone had been waiting for her. Someone who knew her schedule, knew when she'd be alone. It wasn't just cold. It was calculated. Detectives moved quickly to secure the home, wrapping it in yellow crime scene tape. Cameras flashed. Evidence markers were placed around the shattered glass and disheveled furniture. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering anxiously, eyes wide with disbelief. How could something like this happen here? But the deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the picture became. Sheriff Staff Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds stood in the driveway of 718 Hot Springs Drive, arms crossed, eyes scanning the chaotic scene before him. In his 2 decades with the Columbia County Sheriff's Office, he'd seen all manner of domestic disputes, thefts. But something about this case struck a nerve. Later, in a quiet interview, he would admit that this one felt different. It didn't have the randomness of a burglary gone wrong or the obvious signs of a heat-of-the-moment act. This felt personal, intentional, as if someone had arrived not just to take something, but to send a message. The question was, to whom and why? The first theory investigators floated was the most predictable. The husband did it. Spouses are often the first to fall under scrutiny, and in some cases, it's for good reason. David Parsons, however, had a solid alibi. According to phone records and verified travel documentation, he had been across the country in Los Angeles, California for business. The last time he spoke to his wife was the evening before at 6:45 p.m. He'd tried reaching her the next morning unsuccessfully, which concerned him, but not enough to raise alarms until later. Authorities checked everything, including flight manifests and hotel keycard activity. It quickly became clear. David Parsons could not have been in Grovetown that morning. The second theory on the table was more nebulous, a botched burglary. The idea was that someone had broken in expecting an empty house, only to be interrupted when Kay returned home. Things escalated, but even this possibility came with questions. For one, the scene had signs of disarray, but investigators noted that the mess seemed deliberate, almost too deliberate. Then there was Mitchell Cart, the handyman who had made the 911 call after discovering Kay. Detectives sat him down for an interview within hours of the incident. Cart explained he had begun repairs at the house the previous afternoon and returned the next morning just before 9 a.m. to finish the job. He knocked. No answer. Circled to the backyard. That's when he noticed the shattered glass and stepped inside. He found Kay and immediately called emergency services. What stood out? His story matched exactly what he told the 911 dispatcher. The timeline, his movements, even the tone. Nothing wavered. He also claimed that before arriving at Kay's house, he had been working at another nearby home, something that detectives quickly began verifying. Still, as with any person near the scene, he wasn't cleared immediately. Investigators asked themselves, could he have had enough time to commit the crime, clean up, change clothes, and play innocent? While that line of questioning unfolded, Cart mentioned something unusual, something that would send the investigation in a very different direction. As he waited outside for police to arrive, he was approached by a young man, Michael Bowers, 22 years old, living next door. Michael told him that their home had also been broken into that morning. Cart passed this on to deputies, and the next lead was born. Michael Bowers was the son of Rebecca Becky Sears, Kay's next-door neighbor and close friend. Becky, tall and fair-haired, was well known in the area. A mother to 5 boys, she was active in her children's lives and well-liked at the local physical therapy clinic where she and Kay both worked. When she arrived on the scene with her youngest son, Christopher, her concern seemed genuine. She looked shaken and confused. She claimed she'd just gotten a call from Michael, informing her of the break-in at their home. The detective's ears perked up. 2 homes on the same block, allegedly broken into on the same morning? Becky told investigators that she had followed her normal routine that morning, dropping off her children at school and daycare. She said she saw Kay backing out of her driveway just after 8 a.m. That was consistent with other witness accounts, including one from Mrs. Johnson, a neighbor across the street, who also saw Kay leave shortly after 8 to take Derek to school. Becky explained that after dropping off her kids, she went straight to work. She claimed she was only just returning home when she got Michael's call. Deputies made their way to the Bowers residence to inspect the alleged second crime scene. But what they found raised more questions than answers. Unlike Kay's house, where the back sliding door had clearly been broken, there were no signs of forced entry at the Bowers place. No shattered glass, no pried locks. The front and back doors were secure. Inside, though, drawers had been pulled open, cushions were tossed, and the home appeared ransacked. They asked Becky what was missing. She hesitated. Thought? Shrugged. Nothing specific came to mind. She couldn't name a single item that was gone. That was a red flag. To the seasoned investigators on site, this began to look like a staged break-in, perhaps an attempt to create confusion or shift suspicion, but with no clear motive yet, it remained just that, a possibility. Meanwhile, forensic teams split their resources. One group combed Kay's residence, gathering DNA, fingerprints, and any other trace evidence they could find. They documented everything: the broken door, the state of the kitchen, the garage. The second group cataloged the Bowers home. Every drawer, every cushion, just in case. And then, a discovery. DNA found on the back door jamb at Kay's house. At first, this seemed like a promising lead. Investigators hoped it might belong to a third party, perhaps the mysterious intruder. But testing revealed that the DNA belonged to Kay herself. Not unusual, given it was her home, but it left the investigators without a new suspect. Interviews continued. Mr. Carter, 2 houses down, told deputies that the street had been quiet all morning. He hadn't seen any strange cars, no unknown figures pacing around, no disturbances. Another neighbor confirmed that Kay had left just after 8 a.m., but saw nothing else of note. As for Michael Bowers, he cooperated with police but seemed unsure of what exactly had happened. His account was vague. He said he'd heard something around 8:30 a.m. but couldn't explain what. He had no idea who could have done this. He didn't offer much else. Back at the sheriff's office, detectives created a detailed timeline. Kay drops Derek off at school around 8 a.m. She's back home minutes later. Mitchell Cart arrives at 8:45 a.m. By then, it's already too late. Somewhere in that 30-minute window, someone entered her home. Someone who knew she'd be alone. Someone she may have trusted, or at least didn't expect. The once tight-knit Grovetown community, where families waved from driveways and shared casserole recipes over fences, was now awash in speculation. Michael Bowers' version of events was starting to wear thin. On paper, his story wasn't completely implausible. But to seasoned investigators, something about it felt off. When someone finds out their house has been broken into, the first instinct is almost always the same: call the police. But Michael hadn't done that. Instead, he'd called his mother, Rebecca Becky Sears. That raised eyebrow. So, the detectives decided to bring Michael in for formal questioning. They didn't handcuff him. He wasn't under arrest. But they wanted to dig deeper. Michael already had a few blemishes on his record. Minor offenses, but enough to show that he hadn't exactly steered clear of trouble in the past. Still, he wasn't known as violent, just wayward, unfocused. He told police that he had left the house early that morning and gone to a friend's place to hang out. That friend, he claimed, was Anthony, another local young man with a checkered past. Michael said he stayed at Anthony's until sometime after his mother left the house to drop off her younger kids. After that, he walked back home and upon arrival, noticed the mess and made the call to his mom. But detectives had a theory. One that suggested Michael hadn't just found something wrong. He had been at Kay Parsons' home that morning before the handyman arrived. There was physical evidence that couldn't be ignored. The back door of Kay's home had been smashed inward. Shards of broken glass scattered both outside on the patio and inside on the kitchen floor. Investigators asked Michael to remove his shoes just to be sure. That's when they spotted it. A small, sharp sliver of glass was embedded in the tread of his left shoe. They collected it, sealed it in an evidence bag, and rushed it off to the lab. The question now: did that shard match the specific glass from Kay's back door? If it did, Michael's alibi would be seriously compromised. Still, Michael insisted he had nothing to do with what happened. He pointed detectives back to Anthony, confident his friend could confirm his whereabouts. Anthony was brought in shortly after and questioned at length. Despite his own past run-ins with the law, Anthony was calm and cooperative. He said Michael had been at his house that morning and left around 8:30 a.m. Here's where the timeline began to tighten. Michael leaving Anthony's at 8:30 gave him, at most, 15 minutes to walk the mile to Kay Parsons' house and leave before Mitchell Cart, the handyman, arrived at 8:45 a.m. Investigators measured the window carefully. Was it possible? And yet, Michael wasn't cleared. His story still had cracks. He hadn't reacted like someone shocked by a crime. He hadn't called the authorities. The evidence on his shoe remained unexplained. Then, March 27th arrived, and everything changed. Kay Parsons, who had been clinging to life in the hospital, succumbed to her injuries. The case had officially shifted from an assault investigation to a homicide. The stakes, which had already been high, now soared. This was now about justice for a life taken. That very afternoon, an unexpected twist pulled the case in a new direction. Becky Sears, Kay's co-worker, friend, and next-door neighbor, stumbled into her workplace in Augusta visibly shaken. She claimed that a man had appeared out of the bushes and demanded money. According to her, she heard what sounded like a gunshot. She said she didn't see where he went and couldn't describe him clearly. Police from Richmond County responded quickly, canvassed the scene, and looked for evidence. But there were no shell casings, no footprints, no witnesses, nothing to indicate that a shooting or confrontation had actually occurred. It was just Becky's word, and that too was beginning to look suspicious. Then came the call that would crack the case wide open. An inmate at the local county jail, Jerry Jacobs, reached out to law enforcement. Jerry wasn't just any inmate. He was Becky Sears' own brother. Locked up on unrelated charges, Jerry said he had information about the case that couldn't wait. Deputies sat him down, and what he revealed shifted the entire lens of the investigation. According to Jerry, Becky had been involved in a long-standing affair with David Parsons, Kay's husband. Not a brief fling, but a months-long entanglement that had been quietly simmering behind closed doors. Jerry told detectives that Becky had even approached him at one point and asked if he knew anyone who could make Kay disappear. At the time, he brushed it off. But after hearing about the crime, he couldn't ignore the puzzle pieces clicking into place. He also revealed something else. Kay had found out about the affair. The revelation painted a completely different motive. No longer was this about a burglary or a jealous neighbor. This was potentially about jealousy, betrayal, and a calculated plan. Detectives showed Jerry some of the evidence recovered from the crime scene, including a photograph of the tool believed to have been used in the assault. Without hesitation, Jerry identified the hammer as one he had seen at Becky's house before. When asked if Becky could have acted alone, Jerry hesitated. He said it was possible, but unlikely. He believed Becky had help, and he suspected her younger son, Christopher Bowers, had been involved. Unlike her relationship with Michael, Becky had always favored Christopher. She bought him gifts, motorcycles, a truck, even helped rent him a house. He was the golden child, and Jerry believed Christopher would have done anything to protect his mother, or please her. With this new information, investigators turned their attention to David Parsons. They brought him in for a formal interview, and under the weight of evidence and pressure, he admitted to the affair. He claimed it had started the previous summer. From the outside, it had all seemed so normal. Backyard barbecues, tennis matches. But sometimes, the most dangerous secrets grow in plain sight, hidden under the comfort of familiarity. That was exactly what detectives were beginning to realize as they dug deeper into the tangled web of relationships. At the center of the emotional storm was Rebecca "Becky" Sears, Kay's longtime friend, co-worker, and next-door neighbor. And it was through her that the investigators started to piece together a much darker narrative. It started, detectives learned, over something as casual as weekend tennis games. Becky came on strong with David Parsons, Kay's husband. At first, it may have seemed like harmless flirting, but over time, things escalated. David eventually took the bait. He later told investigators that Kay had found out about the affair. The couple had serious discussions, and David claimed that he ended things with Becky shortly after the truth came to light. He said he was committed to repairing the marriage, that he wanted to move forward with Kay and even relocate to a new neighborhood where they could start fresh. But detectives had their doubts. Something in David's demeanor didn't quite add up. He was cooperative, but guarded. The deeper the questioning went, the more cracks began to show in his story. Finally, under pressure, David admitted that he hadn't been entirely truthful. He confessed that he and Becky had spoken on the phone the night before the attack. It hadn't been just a brief check-in. It was a late-night call, emotionally charged. They talked about their feelings, their frustrations, and, according to David, the conversation made it clear. The affair hadn't ended. Not really. Even though David had been over 2,000 miles away in California when the crime occurred, investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that he had been involved in some other way. A physical alibi wasn't the same as a moral one. The ones who could provide more answers, and possibly the truth, were now clearly Becky and her son, Christopher Bowers. Detectives decided to circle back and widen their scope. They canvassed the neighborhood again, digging deeper into what people had seen, heard, or noticed over the past few weeks. What they heard was unsettling. Becky's mother-in-law, Mrs. Sears, told detectives that Becky had recently changed. She had become withdrawn, short-tempered, and, in her words, obsessed with David. Another friend, Lisa, a co-worker from the physical therapy clinic, mentioned that Becky and Kay had been inseparable until recently. They had even joined Weight Watchers together. But then Kay pulled away, abruptly. Lisa had assumed it was stress from work or family obligations. Now, in light of everything, she wasn't so sure. Becky's husband, Tony Sears, was noticeably absent throughout the investigation. Still deployed overseas, he hadn't been present for any of the unraveling chaos. That left Becky as the de facto head of the household, at least in terms of influence. And influence, it turned out, she had plenty of over her children, especially Christopher. Christopher Bowers, 19 years old at the time, lived nearby and had no clear alibi for the morning of the crime. When deputies knocked on his door, he barely spoke. Just short, clipped responses, no cooperation. Meanwhile, Michael, the son whose shoes were tested for glass shards, was slowly being cleared. Forensic tests showed the tiny glass fragment in his sole did not match the type from Kay's back door. That meant attention shifted, and fast, to Becky and Christopher. The turning point came when Becky finally agreed to sit down for a formal interview. At first, she was defensive, but once detectives brought up the affair, something shifted. Her tone softened. She started to cry. She opened up, describing the relationship with David, her emotional turmoil, and how her husband had eventually discovered the affair. She painted herself as someone broken, caught between what she had and what she wanted. Then, the conversation took a dramatic turn. Becky confessed that it had been Christopher who killed Kay. She said she never told him to do it. But she did admit that she had told Christopher how much she loved David, how she wanted to be with him. In her own words, "I didn't ask him to do it. I said how hard it was and how something had to change." It was a vague admission, but a telling one. And then came a bizarre revelation. Becky claimed she picked Christopher up that morning at 4 a.m. Detectives asked her why. Why so early? What was the plan? She couldn't give them a straight answer. Just said that he wanted to come over. That she didn't know what he was going to do. A few hours later, Christopher called her. "Come get me," he said. She drove over, picked him up, asked him what had happened. "All taken care of," he replied. Shortly after that, Michael called to report the supposed break-in at their home. Becky and Christopher returned just in time to act surprised. Investigators later determined that Michael's return was coincidental. He had nothing to do with the crime and was ultimately cleared. But Becky and Christopher? They were at the center of it. As detectives pressed further, Becky admitted something else, that the supposed shooting at her workplace was staged, a distraction, a ploy to confuse the police and muddy the timeline, something that would make investigators consider other possibilities and delay the inevitable. Now the evidence pointed clearly to a chilling conclusion. Christopher Bowers had carried out the attack, but Becky Sears had orchestrated it. Both were arrested and formally charged with murder. And in the eyes of the law, their roles were treated as equal. Under the theory of criminal responsibility, a person who plans or enables a crime can be just as culpable as the one who commits it. Christopher wasn't some seasoned criminal. He was born in 1990, raised mostly by Becky after her first marriage fell apart. He was the second of her 5 sons. Michael, the eldest, was 22 at the time. Christopher followed, then 3 younger siblings, all from Becky's current marriage to Tony Sears. To neighbors, Christopher had always been something of a mystery. Quiet, loyal. A mama's boy, some said, always eager to please Becky, always doing odd jobs for her, driving her places, helping with chores. That same devotion had now become the backbone of a tragedy. Christopher Bowers graduated high school, but unlike many of his classmates who moved on to college or apprenticeships, he stayed behind. He never enrolled in higher education, never pursued a trade certification, never really took the plunge into adulthood in a traditional sense. He remained close to home, sometimes too close, living within a short drive from his mother, Rebecca Becky Sears, and taking on occasional odd jobs here and there. Lawn work, minor repairs, temporary shifts, nothing steady, nothing that stuck. He wasn't a hardened criminal, and his name hadn't crossed law enforcement desks before. No priors, no major incidents. Just a quiet young man, almost forgettable even to his neighbors, who kept to himself and more often than not, seemed content to exist in his mother's shadow. People described him as polite, helpful even. The kind of son who never really left the nest, whether by choice or circumstance. But that unassuming exterior unraveled fast. It wasn't 1 or 2 minor infractions. It was the full weight of Georgia's justice system bearing down on him. Prosecutors hit Christopher Bowers with some of the most severe charges available under the law. At the top of the list, malice murder, the highest form of homicide in the state of Georgia, carrying the possibility of life without parole, or worse. Added to that, felony murder, aggravated assault, burglary, and possession of a weapon during the commission of a crime. And there was evidence. A baseball bat, not just any bat, but one later confirmed to have Christopher's fingerprints on it. On top of that, DNA found on Christopher's shoes matched Kay Parsons, establishing a forensic link between him and the crime scene. Then, the real turning point. Someone from Christopher's own social circle came forward. This witness, whose identity has remained sealed due to safety concerns, told investigators that in the days following Kay's death, Christopher had made a disturbing remark. A boast, really. That he had taken care of something big for his mom. It wasn't a direct confession, but it was close. Close enough to draw serious interest from detectives, who were already watching him closely. Christopher was brought back in. In the interrogation room, he was quiet, detached. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply stared at the table for long stretches, saying nothing. But as the hours passed and the pressure mounted, April 3rd to be exact, he finally broke his silence. What came next wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to change everything. He admitted he had been at Kay Parsons' house that morning. He said it was never supposed to go that far, that he hadn't intended for anyone to get seriously hurt. He didn't hate Kay. He'd grown up next to her. Their families were close. He called her Miss Kay as a kid. They shared meals, watched each other's kids, borrowed sugar and rakes. But this wasn't about Kay. This was about Becky. It was about her affair with David Parsons and the belief that Kay was the one thing standing between Becky and David Parsons. Whether directly asked or quietly implied, Becky's influence loomed large in Christopher's choices that morning. He told detectives he entered the Parsons home after Kay returned from dropping off her son, Derek, at school. But now, the investigation was over. The trial loomed. May 11, 2012. More than 3 years had passed since that quiet March morning in Grovetown, Georgia, was shattered forever. Now, the courtroom in Columbia County Superior Court in Evans, Georgia, was packed to the walls. Reporters lined the rear rows. Friends of Kay Parsons clutched tissues. Members of the Sears and Parsons families sat in uneasy silence. This was the day it would all end. Or so they hoped. Becky Sears and Christopher Bowers stood together in the dock. They faced a list of charges that could have led to the death penalty had prosecutors chosen to pursue it. But in a dramatic turn that caught many off guards, both defendants stood up and pleaded guilty before the trial could begin in earnest. No jury would hear the facts. No cross-examinations. No dramatic witness testimonies. Just the simple final admission of guilt. Judge Cheryl Jolly didn't hesitate. She'd reviewed the evidence, the pre-sentencing reports, the legal motions. The plea was accepted, and the sentence was immediate and uncompromising. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for malice murder. Another life sentence for armed robbery. 20 additional years for burglary. All sentences would be served consecutively, ensuring that neither Becky Sears nor Christopher Bowers would ever walk free again. There would be no parole board hearings, no appeals that could offer a glimmer of hope. Their futures were sealed that day, locked away with the consequences of their decisions. As the courtroom emptied, the atmosphere was heavy. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served.